The gate of Susa is not simply a door. It is a fortress of flawless stone, towering columns, and heavily armed guards. He is terrified. His people are facing extinction, and he is reacting naturally to a tragedy. The familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong. I am returning to the dust. Only divine intervention remains. He is no longer Mordecai, the respected official sitting at the gate. He is a man recognizing that he is entirely powerless to save himself. Haman has ordered that the Jewish people be treated like livestock marked for the slaughter. Mordecai dresses in the hair of livestock, visually acting out the death sentence, yet refusing to hide it. That is why the king's guards could not allow him through the Golden Gate. Sack was the ultimate anti-Persian fabric. It proved that human beings were fragile, that pain was real, and that the king's carefully maintained illusion of absolute control was a lie. But this rough garment does not just appear in the Book of Esther as an isolated expression of grief. It carries a profound biblical history. The heavy, dark goat hair was woven deeply into the memory of his ancestors, long before Mordecai stood weeping outside the Persian palace. This fabric told another story of descent and rescue. This is not the first time the rough goat hair appears. For a Jewish reader, the fabric Mordecai wears is not merely a cultural reflex. It is a historical echo. Throughout Scripture, garments are never simply woven threads. They are architectural markers of destiny. It is incomplete. The problem is that we read this scene through modern eyes, viewing his clothing as a private expression of sadness. A change of clothes always precedes a dramatic shift in authority. Life or death. Centuries earlier, the same image was woven into the genesis of the nation. When Jacob was shown the torn, blood-soaked tunic of his son Joseph, he responded immediately. Genesis 37 records that Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for many days. He believed the narrative he was handed. His son was dead. The future was lost, and the story was over. But the text reveals the hidden truth. The sackcloth was not the end of the history. It was the dark backdrop against which God was already engineering a massive reversal, positioning Joseph in Egypt to eventually save the very family that had been broken. The pattern expands. When an entire empire faces a decree of total destruction, the response is identical. In the book of Jonah, the pagan city of Nineveh receives a 40-day countdown to annihilation. The king of Nineveh does not try to negotiate. He does not order his armies to the walls. He steps down from his throne, removes his royal robe, covers himself with sackcloth, and sits in ashes. He trades the illusion of power for the physical reality of repentance, and the decree of death is overturned. Once the pattern becomes visible, the story reads differently. In the biblical imagination, the descent into sackcloth is never the final word. But in the ancient Persian capital, this was not a private act. It was a profound, calculated, and highly illegal public provocation. It looks like the ultimate defeat. It feels like the heavy, coarse weight of the grave. But biblically, the moment a person strips away their earthly defenses and puts on the fabric of total vulnerability, divine reversal is already in motion. This is the midpoint of the narrative architecture. Up to this point, the question has been historical and legal. Now it becomes a matter of spiritual warfare. Mordecai is standing at the king's gate, participating in this ancient rhythm. He knows that his ancestors traded their fine garments for goat hair and watched seas split, empires bow, and famines break. The Persian decree is terrifying, but it is not sovereign. God's pattern is sovereign, but there is a problem. While Mordecai understands the theological weight of his clothing, the people inside the palace do not. To the Persian court, sackcloth is just an ugly, illegal violation of their aesthetic. And this profound disconnect creates an immediate crisis for the one person caught between both worlds. Queen Esther has been isolated in the royal harem, completely unaware of the genocide Haman has plotted. She does not know about the decree. She does not know about the approaching violence. when her attendants finally rush to tell her that her cousin is weeping at the front gate. They focus on the most culturally offensive detail, his clothes. The writer of Esther includes a detail that changes everything. In Esther, chapter 4, verse 2, the text explicitly states, "The ancient pattern is clear." But in Susa, the appearance of these garments triggers panic instead of repentance. The changing of clothes is about to cause a royal crisis, because Esther attempts to fix the wrong problem. To understand how easily we misread a spiritual emergency, we have to look at what the queen does next. She does not immediately ask what is wrong. She attempts to silence the grief. The news reaches the inner palace, not as a warning of impending genocide, but as an embarrassing breach of protocol. The queen's maids and eunuchs rush to Esther, but they do not mention Haman's decree. They only report the visual scandal. Mordecai is standing outside the king's gate, weeping loudly, covered in ashes and rough goat hair. Esther's immediate reaction is incredibly revealing. The text says she was deeply distressed. But she does not yet know about the death sentence hanging over her people. Her distress is entirely focused on his physical condition and his dangerous location. She is reacting to the Persian reality she now inhabits. In her sheltered world, problems are solved by smoothing over the surface. So, she attempts to fix the appearance of the problem. Esther, chapter 4, verse 4 records her solution. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth. But he would not accept them. This is one of the most tragic and profound interactions in the book. Esther is trying to use the resources of the empire to protect her cousin. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. She sends him clean, state-approved, legal clothing. She is offering him conformity as a shield. If he just takes off the offensive goat hair and puts on the acceptable linen, he can safely pass through the golden gates. He can come inside. He can hide in the safety of the palace. And the crisis will visually disappear. We often do exactly what Esther did. When confronted with deep, agonizing reality, we instinctively reach for superficial fixes. We try to dress the pain in acceptable garments, so it no longer disrupts our peace. But Mordecai's response is absolute. He refuses the garments. By rejecting the clean clothes, Mordecai is sending a devastating message. He is refusing to cover up a spiritual emergency with a state-approved remedy. He will not pretend everything is fine just to gain access to the king. The empire wants him to put on a polite, acceptable wardrobe, so that Ahasuerus does not have to look at the consequences of his own laws. The empire is asking for complicity disguised as etiquette. Mordecai says no. He forces the wound to remain open. This is not simply a story about a man grieving in the streets. It is a story about what happens when we try to medicate a fatal diagnosis with a change of scenery. Esther was offering a cosmetic solution to an existential threat. Mordecai's refusal shatters Esther's remaining illusion. Because he will not accept the clothes, she is forced to send her most trusted messenger to ask why he is wearing the sackcloth. And this is the overlooked contradiction. Mordecai is not wandering aimlessly in his grief. He deliberately walks to the one place in the empire. The true horror of Haman's decree is finally read to the queen. Suddenly, the soft, perfumed walls of the harem offer no protection. Mordecai sends a message back, warning her that the decree of extermination includes her, and that remaining silent in the palace will not save her life. The crisis at the gate has now fully invaded the throne room. Mordecai's stubborn adherence to the forbidden fabric leaves Esther with a terrifying choice. She can no longer hide behind the aesthetics of the empire. She must either remain a Persian queen and watch her people burn, or she must embrace her true identity and risk the king's wrath by approaching the throne uninvited. If he will not change his clothes, she must change her allegiance. The illusion of safety is the hardest thing to surrender. For years, Esther had survived by blending in, eating the king's food, wearing the royal clothes, and keeping her true heritage a closely guarded secret. But Mordecai's message shatters the silence of the harem. He warns her that the palace walls will not protect her from Haman's decree. If she remains silent, deliverance will arise from another place, but she and her father's house will perish. Faced with the absolute reality of her own vulnerability, Esther finally makes her choice. She sends a command back to Mordecai, and in doing so, the narrative pivots entirely. She tells him to gather all the Jewish people present in Susa. They are to hold a fast on her behalf, where his garment is strictly forbidden by law. In the Persian Empire, the king was viewed as a semi-divine figure of endless vitality, neither eating nor drinking for 3 days, night or day. She and her attendants will do the exact same thing inside the palace. After that, she will break the law, approach the king uninvited, and if she perishes, she perishes. Notice what is happening to the scope of the story. What began as one man weeping in rough goat hair at the Golden Gate now sweeps through the entire capital. The text tells us that, in every province where the king's edict arrived, there was great mourning, fasting, weeping, and lamenting. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The forbidden fabric multiplies. The individual protest becomes a communal act of spiritual warfare. But this raises a critical question for modern readers. Does God really require us to wear specific, uncomfortable clothing to hear us? Does he need us to starve ourselves for 3 days before he is willing to intervene? It is easy to misunderstand ancient fasting as a form of spiritual transaction. We sometimes assume that if we inflict enough physical misery on ourselves, God will be obligated to answer our prayers. But that is a pagan view of suffering, not a biblical one. Sackcloth and fasting are not bribes. They are not mechanisms to manipulate the divine will. They are acts of profound alignment. By refusing the food of Susa and embracing the ashes, the Jewish people are systematically stripping away their reliance on the empire. Susa was a city built on consumption, 6-month feasts, endless wine, and infinite luxury. To stop eating and drinking, by royal decree, no reminder of mortality, suffering, or decay was permitted anywhere near his presence. To wear the garments of mourning in the shadow of the king's palace is a radical rejection of the king's provision. It is a physical declaration that the empire cannot save them, and the empire cannot sustain them. This is the key reveal of the turning point. The moment Esther calls for the fast, a massive shift occurs. She and her people stop acting as terrified subjects of Persia, and they begin acting as citizens of the kingdom of God. They stop hiding their writ, identity, and throw themselves entirely upon the mercy of the unseen king. The fasting is not about convincing God to act. It is about preparing the people to be delivered. For 3 days, the Jewish population sits in the dust. For 3 days, Queen Esther removes herself from the banquets and the luxury, joining her people in total vulnerability. The preparation is complete. The stage is now set for the confrontation. But when the 3 days are over, Esther cannot wear sackcloth into the inner court. The spiritual work has been done in the shadows. But the historical victory must be won in the light. To approach the throne, the garments must change again. And what happens next initiates one of the most stunning visual reversals in history. On the 3rd day, the fast ends. The ashes are brushed away. Esther, chapter 5, begins with a deliberate, physical shift. The queen puts off her mourning attire, puts on her royal robes, and steps into the inner court of the palace. To the gates of the king was not just a breach of royal etiquette. It was a direct insult to the crown. She risks her life. But the king extends the golden scepter. She is accepted. From that moment, the narrative accelerates into a spectacular, dizzying sequence of divine reversals. The carefully constructed illusion of Haman's power begins to collapse under its own weight. Haman builds a towering gallows for Mordecai, but through a sleepless night and a forgotten historical record, the king discovers Mordecai's past loyalty. In a moment of devastating irony, Haman is forced to parade Mordecai through the city square, dressing his enemy in the king's own royal garments. The escalation does not stop there. At Esther's second banquet, she finally exposes Haman's plot. The king is enraged. The architect of the genocide is dragged away and executed on the very gallows he built for the man in sackcloth. The enemy is defeated. The king's signet ring, previously given to Haman to seal the decree of death, is removed and handed directly to Mordecai. But the writer of Esther does not end the scene with a simple political appointment. The text focuses precisely on what Mordecai is wearing. Esther, chapter 8, verse 15, records the grand climax. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. It was a crime that could easily be punished by death. This reveals the central question of the narrative. Step back and look at the architecture of the story. Do you recognize the colors? In the first chapter of the book, the king's wealth was displayed through palace tapestries made of white and blue linen, tied with purple cords. Now, those exact colors and fabrics are wrapped around Mordecai's shoulders. The transformation is absolute. This is the visual payoff of the entire narrative. Remember the opening image. Months earlier, this same man stood outside the king's gate, shivering in the stiff, dark goat hair of an agricultural sack. He was an outcast, a walking prophecy of death, barred from the king's presence. Now, he steps out from the presence of the king, clothed in the softest, most expensive materials the ancient world could produce. The heavy, coarse fabric that scraped his skin has been replaced by weightless, breathable linen. The pale gray ash on his head has been replaced by the gleaming weight of a great golden crown. The man who introduced the forbidden fabric of death into the capital is now wearing the colors of heaven and life. God did not simply cancel the decree of destruction. He engineered a complete reversal. The empire that demanded absolute conformity and banished human suffering was forced to place a royal mantle on a Jewish exile who refused to hide his grief. The sackcloth was not the end of his story, designed to project the absolute, unbreakable power of the Persian Empire. Everything here is carefully curated. The colors are rich. If Mordecai's goal was simply to mourn, he could have done so in the privacy of his own home. It was the necessary dark backdrop for his coronation. The tears of Susa have been replaced by shouts of joy. The historical reversal is complete. The political enemies of God's people have been overthrown. But if we stop here, we miss the deepest layer of the pattern. What does this ancient change of clothes mean for you? Because this dramatic exchange of garments in Susa points forward to an even greater and much more costly exchange. The physical transformation of Mordecai is breathtaking, but his story is ultimately a shadow of a much larger reality. Centuries later, another decree of death hung over humanity, a curse much older and more absolute than anything signed in Susa. And to break it, the true king did not sit safely in an isolated palace, demanding perfection and banishing pain. Jesus Christ reversed the Persian model entirely. He did not demand a flawless illusion. Philippians chapter 2 tells us that he stripped himself of the royal robes of heavenly glory. He stepped down from the throne of the universe and put on the ultimate sackcloth, the fragile, vulnerable reality of human flesh. He walked directly into the center of our grief. He allowed his own garments to be violently torn, and he took the ashes of our mortality upon himself. If his goal was to avoid execution by Haman's decree, deliberately breaking a capital law at the king's front door was a strange way to survive, carrying the decree of our death to a Roman cross. The Persian king forbade anyone in mourning from entering his presence. But Jesus Christ became the man of sorrows, so that every mourning, broken, and desperate person could walk freely through the gates of heaven. The cross was the ultimate public exposure of the enemy's cruelty. And the empty tomb was the ultimate royal robe of blue and white. And this is where the ancient history becomes intensely personal. How often do we operate under the rules of Susa? We believe the lie that God only accepts us when our lives look pristine. We try to dress up our spiritual crises in acceptable, polite clothing. We hide our anxiety, our deep grief, our failures, and our secret fears, terrified that if God sees the rough, abrasive edges of our pain, we will be turned away. What are you trying to conceal today? What heavy burden are you covering up with a smile? What have you mistaken for faith? When it is actually just a Persian illusion of control, you do not have to fix your appearance to approach the throne of grace. God is not a Ahasuerus. He does not banish your suffering from his sight. He invites it. He asks you to stop pretending, to take off the heavy armor of your self-sufficiency, and to bring your honest, unfiltered vulnerability directly to him. So why did he do it? This is not ultimately a story about how ancient people express sadness. Remember the weeping man standing at the Golden Gate. He arrived at the most dangerous place in the world, wrapped in the dark, abrasive hair of an animal, entirely powerless, and crying out in the center of the city. He looked like a man whose story was over. The empire thought they were looking at a defeated victim, but they were actually looking at a man standing on the edge of a divine reversal. The sackcloth was never meant to be his grave clothes. It was the dark, necessary backdrop for the world to see, the glory of his coming coronation. When you find yourself sitting in the ashes, when the circumstances against you feel absolute and the waiting feels unbearable, do not hide your tears from God. Do not settle for a cosmetic fix. Hold your ground at the gate. The heavy, coarse fabric of grief you are wearing right now is deeply uncomfortable. But it is not your final wardrobe. The true king has already extended his scepter. God does not ignore our sackcloth. He transforms it into royal garments. It is a story about the collision between human illusion and divine reality. The rough fabric hanging from Mordecai's shoulders is not merely a cultural ritual of grief. It is a physical act of defiance. By weaponizing his clothing, he is dragging the hidden violence of the empire into the public square. He is forcing a crisis that cannot be ignored. But to understand the true danger of what Mordecai is doing at this gate, we have to look behind the walls. We have to understand the fragile illusion the empire was desperately trying to protect. Inside the palace of Susa, the air does not smell of ashes. It is heavy with myrrh, sweet incense, and the lingering exhaust of endless banquets. The floors beneath the royal sandals are paved with porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and expensive colored stones. Massive tapestries of white and blue linen are suspended by silver cords. The architecture is intimidating. The air smells of expensive spices. But today, the aesthetic perfection is broken. From marble columns, this is the world of King Ahasuerus, known to history as Xerxes the Great. It is an environment meticulously engineered to overwhelm the senses. In the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was the undisputed center of the known world, stretching across 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. But maintaining an empire of that magnitude requires more than military superiority. It requires an absolute psychological grip on the population. Ahasuerus ruled through the projection of limitless wealth and unbroken perfection. We see this immediately in the opening chapter of Esther, where the king hosts a staggering 6-month festival for one singular purpose: to display the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness. In this carefully constructed reality, aesthetics were equivalent to power. The king was positioned not merely as a political ruler, but as the supreme source of life, joy, and blessing for his subjects. Because of this, his royal court had to remain entirely insulated from the harsh realities of human existence. Sickness, aging, failure, and sorrow were treated as impurities. They were legally banished from his presence. This explains the absolute law concerning the king's gate. The gate was not just a security checkpoint. It was the psychological boundary between the chaotic, dying world outside and the manufactured paradise of the inner court. The law forbidding mourning garments at the gate was a matter of state theology. To wear sackcloth, there was to violate the king's curated reality. A man walks directly up to this golden entrance, weeping with a loud and bitter cry. The sound of his voice is startling. It was an offensive, visual reminder that the king's power had limits, that despite his endless gold, he could not conquer death, grief, or human suffering. The Persian court demanded a false reality where suffering did not exist. Or, more accurately, a reality where suffering was only permitted if it occurred out of sight. The empire was perfectly willing to inflict immense pain, but it refused to look at the consequences. Haman, the king's highest official, has just weaponized this exact royal detachment. He has easily persuaded Ahasuerus to sign a decree exterminating the entire Jewish population, treating mass murder as a simple bureaucratic transaction. The text deliberately contrasts the palace with the streets. Esther chapter 3 ends with a chilling image. After the decree of genocide was issued, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. This is what makes Mordecai's action so profoundly disruptive. The empire prefers its violence to be abstract. It wants the paperwork signed in the palace. It wants the blood spilled quietly in the provinces. But Mordecai refuses to let the king enjoy his bloodless illusion by wearing the coarse, dark fabric of mourning directly to the threshold of the palace. He is forcing the grim reality of the king's decree into the king's visual field. He is making the invisible visible. How does one man's public agony threaten the most powerful king on earth? But it is what he is wearing that makes this moment incredibly dangerous. He is covered in coarse, dark goat hair, because a dictator's greatest vulnerability is the truth. The decree of mass death has been signed. The royal couriers have been dispatched. And the flawless illusion of Susa is about to shatter. But to understand exactly how the collision unfolds, we have to look closely at the text of the decree itself and the terrifying sound that follows it. The couriers left the capital in a blur of dust and urgency, carrying letters sealed with the king's own ring. They were dispatched on fast horses bred from the royal stud, riding outward in every direction. The instructions inside were not a demand for increased taxes or a call for military conscription. They contained a meticulously planned, empire-wide schedule for genocide. The edict dictated that on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the empire's forces were to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. Furthermore, their neighbors were authorized to plunder their goods. It was industrial-scale slaughter, reduced to a cold, legal memorandum. As the edict was posted on the public walls of Susa, the text notes that the city fell into bewildered confusion. But that civic paralysis was suddenly pierced by a sound that shattered the careful order of the capital, and his head is dusted with the pale gray of crushed ash. Most readers know this scene from the 4th chapter of Esther. Esther chapter 4. Verse 1 tells us exactly how the news was received. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. Notice the deliberate sequence of his actions. The natural human response to an unalterable decree of extermination is to hide, to flee, or to attempt quiet political negotiation behind closed doors. An empire always expects its victims to disappear quietly into the shadows. Instead, Mordecai does the exact opposite. Before he ever puts on the sackcloth, he destroys his normal wardrobe. In the ancient Near East, the tearing of garments was not a gentle, symbolic gesture. It was a violent, audible ripping of fabric, physically exposing the chest. It represented a heart that had been torn open by grief, signaling the absolute end of normalcy. The respectable citizen who previously wore those clothes no longer existed. He had been replaced by a man marked for death. Then, he covers his head with the pale gray of crushed ash and steps into the literal center of the city. He does not whisper his protest. The Hebrew text emphasizes the intensity of his voice. His loud and bitter cry echoes across the busy marketplaces, public squares, and stone courtyards. A high-ranking official named Haman has just manipulated the king into signing a decree of mass annihilation against the Jewish people. In a city where residents carefully moderated their behavior to avoid drawing the attention of the king's informants, Mordecai refused to be quiet. This reveals the hidden contradiction of his behavior. Mordecai is a man who previously operated entirely in the shadows. He had spent years keeping his identity and Esther's lineage, a closely guarded secret to survive in a hostile political climate. But the moment the decree of death is signed, all secrecy is abandoned. By moving directly into the midst of the city, he is acting as a living, breathing indictment of Haman's law. He becomes a walking prophecy of the empire's cruelty. He is publicly embracing the death sentence before it even arrives, daring the Persian guards to do something about it. Mordecai is forcing the hidden reality of the empire's violence directly into the public square. His public mourning is not a retreat, it is an ambush. But to truly understand the weight of this moment, and why it was so visually offensive to the Persian court, we have to look closely at the physical material he chose to wear. What exactly is this garment that carries so much disruptive power? To answer that, we must examine the reality of the fabric itself. When we read this passage, we usually assume a very simple explanation for what happens next. Mordecai is devastated. The Persian court was obsessed with softness. The wealth of the empire was measured in textiles, fine linen, delicate silk, and wool dyed in rich royal blues and purples. Clothing was a second skin that communicated power, immunity, and endless luxury. The opening chapter of Esther specifically highlights the palace tapestries of white cotton and blue hangings caught up with cords of fine linen. Against this backdrop of woven perfection, Mordecai introduces something brutal. The English translation sackcloth sounds to a modern reader like simple burlap or a rough potato sack. That image is close, but it loses the harsh, animal reality of the ancient material. The Hebrew word is sack. In its most basic sense, it simply refers to a coarse mesh, a bag, or a rough cloth. But to understand its physical impact, we must reconstruct how it was made and used in the ancient world. In the ancient Near East, SAQ was woven tightly from the thick, coarse hair of black goats. It was heavy, stiff, and aggressively abrasive. It was an agricultural material, normally used to make the large bags required for transporting heavy grain or goods on the backs of camels and donkeys. It was designed to withstand weather, friction, and dirt. We imagine that he tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth simply because he is expressing his personal grief. It was never meant for human comfort. To wear sack over torn garments where it would inevitably rub directly against bare skin was physically agonizing. Every movement caused the stiff, wire-like hairs to scrape and irritate the flesh. The physical discomfort was highly intentional. The wearer was forcing the body to feel on the outside the devastation that the soul was experiencing on the inside. But the contrast in Susa goes deeper than physical pain. In a society where fine clothing proved your political worth and guaranteed your access to power, choosing to wear a goat hair grain bag was an act of extreme social degradation. It was the deliberate shedding of all human status. The English word sackcloth communicates sorrow, but it misses the total social death of the ancient fabric. The translation is accurate, but the original term carries an additional sense of complete unmaking. By taking off his normal clothes and wrapping himself in the heavy, dark hair of an animal, Mordecai is visually stripping away all earthly rank, wealth, and comfort. He is publicly acknowledging his absolute, unfiltered vulnerability before God. When biblical figures put on sack, they are not merely communicating, "I am sad." They are declaring a state of spiritual emergency. They are saying, human solutions have entirely failed.